On February the 1st, 1974, a young woman named Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her basement apartment near the University of Washington campus. Her roommates noticed her absence that morning when she failed to wake for her radio shift at a local ski resort. When police entered her bedroom, they found her bed carefully made, the pillowcase stained with blood. Her nightgown hung in the closet, also bloodied. A small piece of flesh was discovered on the bedsheet. Whoever had taken Linda had done so while she slept, then paused long enough to arrange the room in a grotesque mockery of normalcy, as if she had simply decided to leave and would return at any moment. But she never did. Over the following months, young women began vanishing from college campuses across Washington state. Donna Gail Manson disappeared from Evergreen State College in Olympia. Susan Rancourt vanished from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Roberta Kathleen Parks went missing from Oregon State University in Corvallis. Brenda Carol Ball disappeared after leaving a tavern south of Seattle. Each disappearance occurred in a different jurisdiction, preventing investigators from connecting the cases. Each young woman was attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle. Each simply ceased to exist, leaving behind dormitory rooms, part-time jobs, worried families, and an expanding silence that no one yet understood was the signature of a single hunter. Then came Lake Sammamish. On July 14, 1974, a bright Sunday afternoon, thousands of people gathered at Lake Sammamish State Park, east of Seattle, for a day of swimming and sun. Among them was Janice Ott, a 23-year-old probation caseworker, and Denise Nasland, who arrived separately with her boyfriend and another couple. Both women had long dark hair. Both would be dead by nightfall. But unlike the previous disappearances, this time there were witnesses. Multiple people reported seeing a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, politely asking young women to help him load a sailboat onto his car. Several women refused. 2 accepted. When police began interviewing witnesses, they developed a composite sketch of a man who called himself Ted. That sketch would be shown on local news broadcasts and printed in newspapers. Thousands of tips would flood in. And one of those tips came from a woman named Elizabeth Klupfer, who called the King County Police to report that the sketch looked exactly like her boyfriend, a charming law student named Ted Bundy. The police thanked her for the tip and did nothing. Before we go deeper into this story, before we explore how one of the most infamous killers in American history operated in plain sight, while the people who knew him best tried desperately to sound the alarm, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this investigation compelling, if you want to see more long-form documentaries that challenge what we think we know about infamous cases, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely means everything and helps me continue creating these deep investigations. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from viewers across the globe who are drawn to these stories that reveal how much stranger and more complex reality is than the myths we've built around it. Now let's step back, because understanding Ted Bundy requires understanding who he was before the name became synonymous with serial murder, before the composite sketches and the trials and the electric chair. It requires going back to November 24, 1946, to a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont, where a young woman named Eleanor Louise Cowell gave birth to a son she named Theodore Robert Cowell. The father's name was listed on the birth certificate as Lloyd Marshall, a detail that was almost certainly fabricated. Eleanor Louise was unmarried, 22 years old, and facing the particular shame that American society in 1946 reserved for women who became pregnant outside of marriage. The Elizabeth Lund home, where Ted was born, was a 3-story brick building that housed women society had deemed fallen. Inside, young mothers-to-be walked sterile hallways that smelled of disinfectant and judgment, their swollen bellies visible proof of their transgressions. Eleanor Louise spent the final months of her pregnancy there, surrounded by other women whose families had sent them away to give birth in secret, to hide the evidence of sex outside marriage. The rooms were sparse, the meals institutional, the atmosphere heavy with shame, and the unspoken understanding that these women would leave without their babies, that adoption was the expected outcome, the respectable solution to an inconvenient problem. But Eleanor Louise made a different choice. She kept her son. And that decision would shape everything that followed. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted was raised in Philadelphia by his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell. He was told that they were his parents and that his mother Louise was actually his older sister. This deception was considered necessary, a way to protect the family from social judgment, a lie told to preserve respectability. Samuel Cowell, by multiple family accounts, was a violent and tyrannical man who abused his wife and reportedly tortured animals. Eleanor Louise would later describe her father as someone who frightened her, a man whose temper could erupt without warning, whose violence infected the household with a constant undercurrent of fear. The family kept a collection of books on the occult in the basement, strange materials that suggested interests that neighbors would have found disturbing. Neighbors later recalled Samuel Cowell as an intimidating presence, a man who kept to himself and whose home you wouldn't want to visit after dark. But in the formal family portrait, they looked like any other working-class American family of the post-war years, gathered together with the solemn expressions that photography of that era demanded, keeping their secrets behind closed doors like everyone else. In 1950, when Ted was 4 years old, Louise moved with him across the country to Tacoma, Washington, to live with relatives and start over. A year later, she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, described by those who knew him as kind but passive, a man who worked steady hours and provided stability but never quite connected with his stepson. Ted took his surname, becoming Theodore Robert Bundy, and 4 more siblings followed. By all external measures, it looked like Louise had successfully escaped her past and built a conventional middle-class life. The Bundy household seemed unremarkable from the outside, a modest home in a working-class neighborhood, a father who left for work each morning in his hospital whites, children playing in the yard, a family that attended church on Sundays and kept their lawn trimmed. But young Ted apparently never bonded with his stepfather. He would later claim that he resented the man, though he never articulated exactly why. Johnny Bundy tried, by all accounts, to be a good father. He took Ted camping, taught him to fish, attended school events, provided financially for the growing family. But there was a distance between them that never closed, an invisible barrier that Ted erected and Johnny couldn't penetrate. What we know is that Ted spent his childhood in a household built on a foundational lie, raised by a man he was told was his father but who wasn't, living alongside a woman he was told was his sister, who was actually his mother, navigating a reality that didn't match what he'd been taught to believe. When did he learn the truth? The answer to that question depends on which version of Ted Bundy is speaking. In some interviews, he claimed he discovered his illegitimate birth as a child. In others, he said he was in his early 20s when he found his birth certificate in a county records office. Ann Rule, the true crime writer who worked alongside Bundy at a Seattle crisis hotline in the early 1970s and later wrote the definitive account of their friendship in The Stranger Beside Me, believed he learned the truth sometime in his late teens or early 20s. What matters is not the precise moment of discovery, but what it represented. The revelation that his entire childhood had been constructed around a lie designed to hide his mother's shame and his own illegitimacy. The family he thought he belonged to was a performance, and he was the secret they were all protecting. Ted Bundy would spend his life constructing performances of his own. In high school, he was shy, socially awkward, a decent student but not exceptional. His classmates later remembered him as forgettable, someone who blended into the background, neither popular nor ostracized. He had few close friends. He didn't date. He spent hours alone, reading, thinking, watching other students navigate social interactions that seemed to come effortlessly to them but remained mystifying to him. There are photographs from this period that show a skinny, uncertain teenager with thick eyebrows and an awkward smile, someone who looked uncomfortable in his own skin, who hadn't yet learned to mask the strangeness that lurked beneath his surface. But something shifted when he entered the University of Puget Sound in 1966 and then transferred to the University of Washington in 1967. He began to remake himself, to study how confident people behaved and to mimic their mannerisms. He started skiing, a hobby that brought him into contact with wealthier students who moved through the world with an ease that fascinated him. He learned how to dress, how to speak, how to present himself as someone who belonged in spaces where he'd previously felt like an intruder. It was a calculated transformation, a deliberate construction of a new identity built on observation and imitation. And then he met Stephanie Brooks. She was everything he wasn't. Wealthy, sophisticated, from a prominent California family, she moved through elite social circles with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having questioned whether you belong. She wore expensive clothes with the carelessness of someone who'd never had to worry about money, spoke about European vacations and family estates with the assumption that everyone had similar experiences, inhabited a world of privilege that Ted had only glimpsed from the outside. She was beautiful, with long dark hair parted in the middle, high cheekbones, and the kind of effortless poise that can't be taught or faked. And for reasons that remain unclear, she agreed to date this awkward young man from Tacoma who was clearly trying very hard to be someone he wasn't. For a brief time, Ted inhabited the life he thought he wanted. He skied at expensive resorts, attended parties with people from old money families, imagined a future where he could permanently join this world that had always existed just beyond his reach. He was introduced to Stephanie's parents at their sprawling California home, where servants brought drinks on silver trays and the casual conversations referenced people and places that represented a level of wealth and connection Ted had never experienced. He met her friends, graduates of prestigious prep schools who spoke in a verbal shorthand that marked them as members of an exclusive club. He tried to keep up, to present himself as someone who belonged in their company, to perform the role of the sophisticated boyfriend worthy of Stephanie Brooks. But Stephanie saw through the performance. In 1968, she ended the relationship, telling him he lacked direction, ambition, maturity. He wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't enough. The breakup occurred during a phone call, her voice cool and certain as she explained that while she cared about him, she couldn't see a future together, that he needed to figure out what he wanted from life before he could be a real partner to anyone. She was kind but firm, as though she were letting down an employee who hadn't worked out rather than ending a romantic relationship. By all accounts, Ted was devastated. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. According to Bundy himself, in interviews conducted years later, the breakup triggered a period of depression and aimlessness. He dropped out of school, he worked menial jobs, he drifted. But something else was happening during these years, something that wouldn't become visible until much later. He became a volunteer at a Seattle crisis hotline where he met Anne Rule, herself a former police officer who had begun writing true crime articles for detective magazines. She found him charming, compassionate, surprisingly good at talking desperate people away from the edge of suicide. He seemed genuinely invested in helping others. At the same time, he was becoming involved in Republican Party politics, working on campaigns, making connections with powerful men who saw potential in this articulate young volunteer. He returned to the University of Washington and completed a degree in psychology in 1972. He applied to law schools. He was building a new version of himself, more polished, more credible, more convincing. And then in 1973, he did something that only makes sense if you understand that for Ted Bundy, Life was a series of performances designed to prove something to people who were no longer watching. He reconnected with Stephanie Brooks. He called her out of nowhere after 5 years of silence, and somehow he convinced her to give him another chance. She saw that he'd changed, that he'd earned a degree, that he was attending law school at the University of Puget Sound, that he'd become the ambitious, directed person she'd criticized him for not being. They started dating again. They talked about marriage. She introduced him to her parents, and just when she began to believe this might actually work, Ted ended it. Abruptly, coldly. He simply stopped returning her calls. When she finally reached him and asked why, he told her in a flat, emotionless voice that he'd never cared about her at all, that he'd simply wanted to prove he could get her back. Then he hung up. Think about what that means. 5 years of building a new identity, of erasing the aimless boy she'd rejected and replacing him with a convincing simulation of success, all for the sole purpose of recreating the relationship so he could be the one to destroy it. 5 years to engineer a single moment of revenge that she would remember for the rest of her life. 5 years to prove that he was in control, that he could not be dismissed, that he decided when things ended. Now ask yourself, what else was he doing during those 5 years? Because here is what we know with absolute certainty. On January the 4th, 1974, a young woman named Karen Sparks was beaten in her basement apartment near the University of Washington. She survived, but with permanent brain damage, unable to ever identify her attacker. On February the 1st, 1974, Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her own basement apartment just blocks away, her bedroom staged to look as though she'd left voluntarily, blood soaked into her pillow and nightgown. Over the following 6 months, at least 6 more young women vanished from Washington and Oregon. All were in their late teens or early 20s. All had long dark hair, parted in the middle. All resembled Stephanie Brooks. The official narrative is that Ted Bundy began killing in early 1974 when he was 27 years old. But investigators have always suspected that timeline is incomplete. There are unsolved disappearances from the years before, cases that fit his pattern but occurred before the official spree began. The most haunting is the case of Anne Marie Burr, an 8-year-old girl who vanished from her Tacoma home in 1961 when Ted Bundy was 14 years old and living in the same neighborhood. He would later be asked directly about Anne Marie Burr in interviews with detectives. He never confessed, but he never quite denied it either. He would smile, that strange, flat smile that people who met him always remembered, and say something evasive about how he couldn't be sure what he'd done when he was that young, how memory was a strange thing, how certain details from childhood remained frustratingly unclear. What we're confronting here is not just a question of numbers, of how many victims or when the killing truly started. We're confronting the gap between what Ted Bundy was willing to admit and what the evidence suggests, the space between the story he told about himself and the one that emerges from police reports, witness statements, forensic analysis, and the testimony of people who knew him during the years when he was simultaneously volunteering at a suicide prevention hotline and hunting women across the Pacific Northwest. Let's talk about that hotline job for a moment, because it reveals something essential about how Bundy operated. The crisis hotline, where he worked alongside Ann Rule, was run by a county mental health agency, and volunteers received training in psychological counseling techniques. By all accounts, Ted was good at the work. Ann Rule, who spent countless hours working shifts with him, described him as empathetic, patient, skilled at de-escalating people in acute crisis. She remembered him talking a young woman out of suicide, his voice calm and reassuring, telling her that whatever she was facing could be endured, that the pain would pass, that she mattered. After the call ended, Ted turned to Anne and they discussed the techniques he'd used, the way he'd validated the caller's feelings while redirecting her focus toward reasons to stay alive. Anne thought he had a natural gift for the work. She thought he genuinely cared. And maybe, in some compartmentalized corner of his psychology, he did. Maybe he could access authentic empathy during those phone calls, could genuinely connect with strangers in crisis, and then shut off that empathy entirely when he was stalking his next victim. Or maybe the hotline was simply another performance, a role he played because it provided useful cover and allowed him to study human vulnerability from a position of trust. We can't know which is true because Ted Bundy spent his entire life lying, even when the truth would have served him better, even when there was nothing left to gain from deception. What we can know is what happened at Lake Sammamish on July 14, 1974, because for the first time, Bundy's predation occurred in front of witnesses. It was a perfect summer day, the kind of Sunday when everyone in Seattle wanted to be outside, away from the city, near the water. The temperature had climbed into the mid-80s by midday, warm but not oppressive, with a light breeze coming off the lake that carried the smell of sunscreen and barbecue smoke. Families spread blankets on the grass. Teenagers played volleyball. Children shrieked with delight as they ran into the cold water. An estimated 40 Grouan people visited Lake Sammamish State Park that afternoon, creating a carnival atmosphere of laughter, music from portable radios, the sizzle of hot dogs on grills. Among them was a young man with his arm in a sling, handsome in a conventional way, polite, unthreatening. He wore casual clothes, a white tennis outfit that made him look athletic despite the injured arm, and he moved through the crowds with an easy confidence that suggested he belonged. He approached multiple young women throughout the day, all of them alone or separated from their groups, and he asked for help. His sailboat was on his car, he explained, but with his injured arm, he couldn't manage it alone. Could they help him for just a few minutes? Most women declined. Some felt instinctively uncomfortable and walked away. One woman later told police that she'd agreed to walk toward the parking lot with him, but had stopped when she noticed he was leading her away from the main parking area toward a more secluded section. Something about the situation had felt wrong, a visceral unease she couldn't articulate, and she'd made an excuse and returned to her friends. That instinct may have saved her life. But a few agreed to help. Witnesses later reported seeing him talking to Janice Ott around noon. She was sitting on her bicycle near the park entrance, her long dark hair bright in the sunlight when he approached. Several people nearby overheard fragments of their conversation. He was friendly, charming, made a joke that made her smile. She agreed to help and walked away from the beach area with him toward the parking lot, wheeling her bicycle alongside her. She never returned. 4 hours later, around 4:00 p.m., he approached Denise Naslund, who had briefly separated from her boyfriend and friends to use the restroom. Witnesses saw them talking near the bathrooms. She seemed uncertain at first, glancing back toward where her group was sitting, but he said something that convinced her. Then she, too, walked toward the parking lot and vanished. Her boyfriend searched for her until the park closed at dusk, assuming she'd gotten upset about something and left. It wasn't until the next day, when both women failed to return home, that anyone realized something was wrong. The police investigation that followed was massive. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people who'd been at the park that day. 8 different witnesses reported seeing the man with the sling. Several remembered him introducing himself as Ted. The composite sketch that emerged from their descriptions was specific enough to generate thousands of tips. People called in to report boyfriends, co-workers, neighbors, ex-husbands, anyone who resembled the drawing and owned a Volkswagen Beetle, which several witnesses had also mentioned. The sheer volume of tips overwhelmed investigators. Somewhere in that flood of information were at least 4 reports about Ted Bundy, one from his girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, one from Anne Rule, one from a psychology professor who'd supervised his work at the crisis hotline, and one from a woman who'd met him at the Republican Party office where he volunteered. 4 people who knew him personally called to report him as a potential suspect, and nothing happened. Why? That question has haunted the Bundy case for decades. The standard explanation is that the police were overwhelmed, that tips were prioritized based on available evidence, that Bundy seemed like an unlikely suspect because he was educated, articulate, had no criminal record, and worked in crisis intervention and politics, fields that suggested altruism rather than predation. But there's another explanation, one that's less flattering to the systems we trust to protect us. The police didn't take the tips seriously because Ted Bundy didn't look like their idea of what a serial killer should look like. He wasn't a drifter or a dropout. He wasn't obviously disturbed. He presented as normal, even admirable. And in 1974, before the FBI had developed sophisticated criminal profiling techniques, before anyone really understood that serial killers could be handsome law students who volunteered at suicide hotlines, that normality was a form of camouflage that investigators simply couldn't see through. Elizabeth Klopfer, the woman who'd been dating Ted since 1969, called the police twice to report him. The first time was after the Lake Sammamish abductions, when she saw the composite sketch and recognized her boyfriend immediately. She stared at the drawing in the newspaper, her coffee growing cold on the table in front of her, as a sick certainty settled in her stomach. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the face, the hair, the features, it was Ted. She thought about his Volkswagen Beetle, about the plaster of Paris she'd found in his apartment, about the crutches, about all the times he'd disappeared without explanation and returned with vague stories about where he'd been. She picked up the phone 3 times before she managed to dial. Her hands were shaking. What if she was wrong? What if she was about to destroy the life of an innocent man based on a resemblance to a sketch? But what if she was right, and she said nothing? When the detective answered, she forced herself to speak. "I'm calling about the Lake Sammamish case," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The composite sketch in the paper. I think I know who it is." The detective's tone became attentive. "Go ahead, ma'am." "His name is Ted Bundy. He's my boyfriend. He owns a Volkswagen Beetle. He matches the description exactly." There was a pause. She could hear the detective writing something down. "And why do you think your boyfriend might be involved in this case?" She explained everything. The physical resemblance, the car, the strange items in his apartment, his unexplained absences, the times she'd woken in the night to find him gone. The detective listened, asked a few clarifying questions, thanked her for the information. "We'll look into it," he said. "We appreciate you calling." But they didn't look into it. Not seriously. Not enough. The second time was months later, when she read a newspaper article about the investigation and noticed that the victims all resembled her. Young, long, dark hair parted in the middle, slender build. She looked at photographs of the missing women and saw herself in their faces. She called the King County police detective assigned to the case and told him everything, that Ted matched the description, that he owned a Volkswagen Beetle, that he kept plaster of Paris and crutches in his apartment for reasons he'd never adequately explained, that he often disappeared for days without explanation, that he'd recently started wearing his hair differently and had grown a mustache which matched updated witness descriptions. The detective thanked her for the information and told her they'd look into it. They didn't. Years later, after Bundy had been arrested, tried, and convicted, Elizabeth would learn that her tip had been filed and forgotten. The detective she'd spoken to would say he'd found Bundy's name interesting, but not compelling enough to prioritize, that there'd been too many other leads that seemed more promising, that he'd checked Bundy's background and found nothing alarming. This is technically true. Ted Bundy had no adult criminal record in 1974. What the detective didn't know, because it happened when Ted was a juvenile and records were sealed, was that Bundy had been arrested twice as a teenager for burglary and auto theft. Those records were inaccessible to police running background checks, so the detective looked at Ted Bundy and saw a clean record, a university education, volunteer work, political connections, and a girlfriend who seemed perhaps overly suspicious, possibly jealous or paranoid, certainly not credible enough to warrant serious investigation. And the killing continued. In the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. The disappearances in Washington state stopped abruptly, and young women began vanishing in Utah. The pattern was identical: college-age women, long dark hair, taken from areas near universities or shopping centers, their bodies later discovered in remote areas, all showing signs of blunt force trauma and sexual assault. Between October 1974 and August 1975, at least 5 women disappeared in Utah, and several more vanished from neighboring Colorado. Investigators in each state worked their cases independently, unaware that the same killer was moving between jurisdictions. But something changed on November 8, 1974. That night, a young woman named Carol DeRonch had an experience that would eventually help convict Ted Bundy, though she didn't know it at the time. She was shopping at a mall in Murray, Utah, when a man approached her in the parking lot and identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told her someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to the station to file a report. Carol hesitated. The man was handsome, well-spoken, dressed in casual clothes rather than a uniform. He wore a moustache and his hair was neatly combed, and he spoke with the kind of calm authority that suggested he was exactly who he claimed to be. But something felt off. She asked to see his identification. He showed her a badge, though later she wouldn't be able to remember specific details about it, whether it looked official or not, whether it said Murray Police or something else. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone friendly, but with an edge that suggested impatience. "No, I wasn't expecting this," she said, glancing back toward the mall entrance where other shoppers were walking to their cars. Everything looked normal. Safe. If her car had really been broken into, it made sense that the police would want her to file a report. She noticed he was handsome, well-spoken, dressed in casual clothes rather than a uniform, but he seemed professional and his story seemed plausible enough. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle. As he drove, Carol began to feel uneasy. The streets he was taking didn't lead toward the police station. The neighborhoods were getting darker, less populated. She asked where they were going. "The substation," he said, not looking at her. "It's just a few more blocks." But the car kept moving away from the commercial district, into residential areas where streetlights were sparse. Carol's heart began to race. She put her hand on the door handle, calculating whether she could jump out if the car slowed down. When she questioned him again, he claimed they were going to a substation. Then he pulled over abruptly on a quiet street lined with dark houses, reached across her, and tried to handcuff her wrist. The metal closed around her left wrist with a sharp click, but the second cuff dangled loose. He'd failed to secure her other hand. She screamed and fought back. He pulled out a gun, a small revolver that he pointed at her head with shaking hands. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stared at each other in the dim interior of the car, her wrist trapped in the handcuff, his gun wavering between them. "Please," she whispered, "please don't." Instead of answering, he lunged across the seat, grabbing for her with his free hand. She managed to get the car door open and stumbled out onto the street, falling to her knees on the pavement. He chased her, pulling a crowbar from somewhere, a heavy metal bar that he swung at her head. She ducked, and the crowbar whistled past her ear, close enough that she felt the displacement of air. She screamed for help and ran toward the highway, her lungs burning, the handcuff banging against her wrist. A car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. She ran into the middle of the street, waving her arms, and the car screeched to a stop. It was a couple, older, their faces shocked as they saw her terrified expression, the handcuff dangling from her wrist. "Please, please help me. Someone tried to kidnap me," she gasped, and they pulled her into the back seat and locked the doors. Through the rear window, she saw the man who'd attacked her standing in the street, watching. Then he turned and walked calmly back to his Volkswagen and drove away. The man who'd attacked her disappeared into the darkness. Carol Duronch's description of her attacker and his car matched the descriptions from Lake Sammamish. But more importantly, she'd escaped, which meant she could identify him. She worked with police to create a composite sketch. She described the handcuffs he'd used, which were unusual because only one cuff had closed. The other dangled uselessly, suggesting he'd either broken them or didn't know how to use them properly. And she'd noticed the interior of his car in detail, the tear in the seat, the location of the door handle she'd frantically grabbed to escape. That same night, about an hour after Carol Duronch escaped, a high school drama teacher named Jean Graham was in an auditorium at a nearby school watching a play when a handsome man approached her and asked if she could come to the parking lot to identify a car. She declined. Later, a student named Deborah Kent left the auditorium during intermission and never returned. A small handcuff key was later found in the parking lot where she was last seen. It matched the handcuffs used on Carol Duronch. For the first time, investigators had a surviving victim who could identify the killer and testify in court. But they still needed to find him. And that wouldn't happen until a routine traffic stop in a quiet Salt Lake City suburb in August 1975. On the night of August 16, 1975, a highway patrol officer named Bob Hayward was driving through a residential neighborhood when he noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly with its headlights off. When he turned on his patrol car lights to investigate, the Beetle suddenly accelerated and ran a stop sign. Hayward pursued, and the driver eventually pulled over. The man who stepped out of the car was polite, articulate, and had a ready explanation. He'd been at a drive-in movie and gotten lost on his way home. Officer Hayward looked inside the car and saw that the passenger seat had been removed. He asked to search the vehicle. Ted Bundy consented, and Hayward found a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, handcuffs, and rope. Bundy was arrested for evading police and possessing burglary tools. At the station, detectives noticed that he matched descriptions from several unsolved cases. His Volkswagen Beetle matched the car Carol Duronch had described. When they showed her a photo lineup, she identified him immediately as the man who'd attacked her. In October 1975, Ted Bundy was charged with aggravated kidnapping in the Carol Duronch case. During the investigation that followed, detectives discovered gas receipts that placed Bundy in Colorado on the dates when several women had disappeared there. They found hair fibers in his car that were microscopically similar to hair from missing victims. And slowly, across multiple states, investigators began connecting cases that had seemed unrelated. The FBI became involved, a special task force was formed, and for the first time, the scope of what Ted Bundy had been doing became visible. But he was only charged with one crime, the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duronch, a woman who'd escaped because she fought back and got lucky. The trial began in February 1976, and Bundy decided to represent himself with a public defender as backup counsel. He cross-examined witnesses, made legal arguments, presented himself as confident and capable. The prosecution's case relied primarily on Carol Duronch's eyewitness identification and the physical evidence from his car. Bundy's defense was that he'd been misidentified. that the evidence was circumstantial, that he was being targeted because he fit a profile rather than because there was concrete proof he'd committed any crime. The judge, Stuart Hanson, heard the case without a jury at Bundy's request. On March 1, 1976, Judge Hanson delivered his verdict, guilty. He sentenced Bundy to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. But this was just the beginning. Detectives in Colorado had been building their case, and in October 1976, Bundy was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who disappeared from a ski resort in Snowmass, Colorado, in January 1975. Her body had been found a month later in a ditch along a dirt road, her skull fractured from blunt force trauma. Bundy was extradited to Colorado to await trial. And this is where the story shifts into something that feels less like a criminal investigation and more like a dark psychological thriller, because Ted Bundy was not interested in accepting the role of prisoner. He'd been studying law. He knew the system. He understood that his best chance of avoiding conviction was to disrupt the process, delay the trial, create chaos. And he had one advantage that most defendants lack. He was physically fit, intelligent, and absolutely certain he was smarter than everyone trying to contain him. On June 7, 1977, during a pre-trial hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Bundy asked to visit the courthouse law library to research his case. The request was granted. He was escorted to the library on the second floor, alone and uncuffed, because he was representing himself, and defendants have the right to access legal resources. At some point, the guard stationed outside the library stepped away for a few minutes. When he returned, Ted Bundy was gone. Investigators later determined that Bundy had jumped from the library window, injured his ankle in the fall, and simply walked out of the courthouse. He was free for 6 days, during which he survived in the mountains, broke into cabins for food and shelter, and traveled toward Aspen before being recaptured on June 13th when deputies spotted him driving a stolen car erratically. Most people, after escaping from custody and being caught, would recognize that security would now be exponentially tighter, that another escape was effectively impossible. Ted Bundy spent the next 6 months planning exactly that. He was moved to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, a facility considered more secure than the Aspen courthouse. He was placed in a cell on the top floor. And over the following months, he acquired a hacksaw blade, systematically lost over 30 pounds to make his body smaller, and studied the building's architecture. On December 30th, 1977, when most of the jail staff were on holiday leave, Bundy crawled through a hole he'd cut in the ceiling of his cell, navigated through the crawl space to the apartment of the chief jailer, which was unoccupied, changed into civilian clothes he found there, and walked out the front door of the jail. This time, he stayed free for 38 days. And during those 38 days, he killed at least 3 more people. He traveled across the country to Tallahassee, Florida, using stolen credit cards and identities. He rented a room near the Florida State University campus using the name Chris Hagen. And on the night of January 15, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house through an unlocked door and moved through the building, attacking sleeping women with a wooden club. Margaret Bowman, 21 years old, was beaten to death in her bed. Her skull was fractured. She was strangled with pantyhose. Lisa Levy, 20 years old, was beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Her body showed bite marks on her buttock and nipple. Both women were killed in their sleep. 3 other women in the house, Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas, were attacked and severely injured, but survived. The entire assault lasted approximately 15 minutes. A witness saw a man leaving the sorority house carrying a wooden club, described as wearing dark clothing and a knit cap. Another witness heard screaming and running footsteps, but By the time police arrived, the attacker was gone. Less than 3 weeks later, on February the 9th, 1978, a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach disappeared from her school in Lake City, Florida. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Bundy's description leading a girl toward a white van in the school parking lot. Kimberly's body was found 8 weeks later in an abandoned pig shed. She'd been strangled. The medical examiner's report indicated she'd been sexually assaulted, though decomposition made it impossible to determine the full extent of injuries. Ted Bundy was finally arrested for the last time on February 15, 1978, when a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, ran the license plates on an orange Volkswagen Beetle he'd noticed driving erratically and discovered it was stolen. When the officer approached the car, the driver tried to flee, and a physical struggle ensued. The officer subdued him and placed him under arrest. The man claimed his name was Kenneth Misner, but his identification didn't match that name. At the station, when detectives checked his fingerprints, they discovered he was Ted Bundy, the escaped Colorado murder suspect who'd been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. In his possession were stolen credit cards in multiple names. His car contained receipts that placed him in Tallahassee and Lake City on the dates of the Chi Omega and Kimberly Leach attacks. And perhaps most significantly, when forensic odontologists examined the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body and compared them to dental impressions taken from Ted Bundy, they found a match. His teeth had left a unique pattern in her flesh, a signature written in violence that could be definitively linked to him. The trial for the Chi Omega murders began in June 1979 in Miami, where the case had been moved to ensure an impartial jury. Bundy again chose to represent himself, with attorneys assigned to assist him. The prosecution's case was built on physical evidence, the bite mark testimony, the witness descriptions, the timeline that placed Bundy in Tallahassee, and the testimony of the Chi Omega survivors who'd seen the attacker. The courtroom was packed every day, journalists filling the gallery, cameras recording every moment for what had become the first nationally televised murder trial in American history. Bundy seemed to thrive on the attention. He would turn to smile at the cameras, adjust his tie, before addressing the judge, perform for the audience watching at home. During jury selection, he questioned potential jurors with surprising sophistication, asking about their views on circumstantial evidence, their ability to remain impartial, their opinions on the death penalty. Some of the jurors later admitted they'd found him charming during this process, that it was difficult to reconcile the articulate, well-mannered man questioning them with the brutal crimes described in the indictment. The defense argued that the bite mark evidence was unreliable, that eyewitness descriptions were inconsistent, that the prosecution had no direct proof Bundy had been inside the sorority house. Ted Bundy performed. He cross-examined witnesses with theatrical confidence. He made impassioned arguments to the jury about reasonable doubt and the dangers of convicting someone based on circumstantial evidence. He presented himself as a victim of a rush to judgment, a man being railroaded by investigators, desperate to close unsolved cases, and through it all, he maintained the same charming, articulate persona he'd cultivated for years, speaking to the jury as though they were colleagues engaged in intellectual discourse, rather than 12 people deciding whether he should die for murdering 2 young women in their sleep. On July 24, 1979, after deliberating for less than 7 hours, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. The penalty phase began immediately. The same jury that had convicted him would now decide whether he should be sentenced to death. On July 31st, they recommended death. Judge Edward Cowart, who'd presided over the trial, formally sentenced Bundy to death by electrocution. And in a moment that has been quoted countless times since, Judge Cowart addressed Bundy directly. "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. It's a tragedy to this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. A second trial followed in January 1980, this time for the murder of Kimberly Leach. The evidence included witness testimony placing Bundy near her school, fibers from the white van he'd been seen driving that matched fibers on Kimberly's body, and testimony from a prison informant who claimed Bundy had confessed to him. On February 7, 1980, the jury again returned a guilty verdict. Bundy was sentenced to death for the second time. He would spend the next 9 years on death row, filing appeals, giving interviews, and becoming one of the most studied serial killers in American criminal psychology. Researchers, FBI profilers, journalists, and psychologists all wanted to understand him, to find the key that would unlock the mystery of why an intelligent, educated man with every apparent advantage would dedicate years of his life to hunting and killing women. And Ted Bundy, who had always craved attention and validation, gave them what they wanted up to a point. He spoke about his childhood, his discovery of his illegitimate birth, his relationship with Stephanie Brooks, his pornography consumption, the influence of alcohol. He presented himself as a case study, a puzzle to be solved, always maintaining a degree of control over his own narrative. But he never told the complete truth, even when he finally began confessing to murders in the days before his execution, when he was attempting to negotiate delays by offering information about unsolved cases. He remained evasive about details, contradicted himself, hinted at more victims than he would name. Investigators who interviewed him during this period described the experience as frustrating because Bundy seemed to view the confessions as a game, parceling out information strategically, maintaining power over the process, even as he sat in a cell awaiting electrocution. One of those investigators was Robert Keppel, the detective from King County, Washington, who'd been involved in the original Lake Sammamish investigation. In the late 1980s, Keppel was working on the Green River Killer case, another series of murders targeting women in the Seattle area, and he contacted Bundy to ask for insights into how a serial killer thinks, operates, and avoids detection. Bundy agreed to the interviews, and over several sessions, he provided information that he claimed would help catch the Green River Killer. But Keppel later wrote that Bundy seemed more interested in demonstrating his own intelligence than in genuinely helping the investigation. He would speak in hypotheticals, describing what a killer might do in certain situations, occasionally slipping into first-person language before catching himself and returning to the theoretical frame. He was confessing without confessing, admitting without taking responsibility. In January 1989, as his execution date approached and final appeals were exhausted, Bundy made a last attempt to delay his death. He told investigators he was ready to confess to additional murders, to provide details about unsolved cases, to give families closure. He spoke to detectives from multiple states, describing crimes in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and California. The number of confessed victims climbed from the original estimate of around 20 to over 30, but investigators suspected even this was incomplete. Some estimates placed his actual victim count at 100 or more. Bundy himself, when asked directly, would only say that the number was higher than anyone thought, that there were victims who'd never been connected to him, that some bodies would never be found. On January 23, 1989, the day before his execution, Bundy gave his final interview to James Dobson, a Christian psychologist and founder of Focus on the Family. In that interview, Bundy claimed that his violence had been caused by pornography addiction, that exposure to sexually violent material had warped his psychology and led him down a path toward murder. He presented himself as a victim of pornography, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obscene material. The interview was later broadcast and became infamous, not because it provided genuine insight into Bundy's psychology, but because it was so transparently self-serving, a final performance designed to shift blame away from himself and onto an external cause that would resonate with a particular audience. Psychologists who'd evaluated Bundy over the years rejected this explanation. They pointed to the evidence of planning, premeditation, and methodical victim selection that characterized his crimes. They noted that millions of people consume pornography without becoming violent, that pornography does not create serial killers, that Bundy's explanation was a deflection designed to avoid confronting the reality of his own choices. Anne Rule, who'd known him personally and written extensively about the case, said bluntly that Bundy was lying, that he'd always lied, that even facing death he could not stop performing and manipulating. At 7:00 a.m. on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was escorted to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. The walk from his cell to the death chamber took 3 minutes. His legs were shackled, and he moved with small, shuffling steps, guards on either side. His face was pale, drained of the arrogant confidence that had characterized his courtroom performances. This was real now. This was the end he'd managed to postpone for nearly a decade through appeals and legal maneuvering and strategic confessions, and there was no escape left. Outside, a crowd of approximately 200 people had gathered, many holding signs and cheering. Some wore shirts with messages like "Burn Bundy Burn" and "Tuesday is Friday." Vendors sold commemorative T-shirts. People set up lawn chairs as though they were attending a sporting event. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, a grotesque carnival atmosphere that spoke to the public's hunger for closure, for revenge, for the satisfaction of watching evil punished. When the execution was announced, the crowd erupted in celebration. Fireworks were set off, car horns honked. It was a spectacle, a public catharsis, the end of a story that had dominated news coverage for over a decade. Inside the chamber, Bundy was strapped into the electric chair known as Old Sparky. The leather straps were tightened around his chest, his arms, his legs, binding him immobile. His head and right leg were shaved to ensure proper contact with the electrodes. The metal cap was fitted to his head, the electrode attached to his leg. A leather hood was placed over his face, hiding his expression from the witnesses assembled behind the glass. He declined to make a final statement beyond asking that his love be given to his family and friends. His voice, when he spoke those words, was barely audible, stripped of the charm and confidence that had defined him for so long. At 7:16 a.m. the executioner pulled the switch. 200 volts of electricity surged through his body for 1 minute. His body strained against the straps, fingers clenched, muscles contracting violently. Then it was over. The current was stopped. The prison doctor stepped forward, placed a stethoscope against Bundy's chest, and listened for a heartbeat. He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. Outside, the crowd cheered. News cameras captured the celebration, the fireworks, the sense of closure that his death seemed to provide to people who'd followed the case for years. He was 42 years old. Now let's pause and examine what we think we know about Ted Bundy, because the story that's been told and retold in the decades since his execution has calcified into a mythology that obscures as much as it reveals. If you ask most people what they know about Ted Bundy, they'll tell you some version of the same narrative. He was extraordinarily handsome, charming, and intelligent, a genius-level killer who fooled everyone around him, a man who could have been anything but chose to become a monster, a predator, so skilled at manipulation that no one suspected him until it was too late. But how much of that is actually true? Let's start with the claim that he was extraordinarily handsome. Look at actual photographs of Ted Bundy from the 1970s, not the posed shots selected for documentaries and true crime articles, but the candid images from his college years, his political volunteer work, his mug shots. What you see is a conventionally attractive man by the standards of that era. Straight teeth, regular features, dark hair, nothing exceptional. He wasn't ugly, but he wasn't notably handsome either. He looked like thousands of other young men in the Pacific Northwest during the 1970s. The narrative of extraordinary handsomeness emerged partly from his own self-presentation, partly from the media coverage during his trials, when courtroom artists drew him in flattering ways and cameras captured his most photogenic angles, and partly from the retrospective need to explain how he'd been able to lure victims. If he was irresistibly handsome, then the victim's willingness to trust him made sense. But witness descriptions from Lake Sammamish describe him as good-looking or nice-looking, not as strikingly attractive. Carol Duranch, who spent time in a car with him, described him as average-looking. The myth of extraordinary handsomeness is exactly that, a myth created to make the story more compelling. What about intelligence? Bundy is routinely described as brilliant, genius level, a man who could have been a successful attorney or politician if he'd chosen a different path. He studied law. He represented himself at trial. He escaped from custody twice. Surely this demonstrates exceptional intelligence, except when you examine the evidence, a different picture emerges. His IQ was tested multiple times and consistently scored around 124, which is above average, but nowhere near genius level. A genius IQ is generally considered to start around 140. Bundy was smart, but not exceptionally so. He attended University of Washington and earned a psychology degree, but his academic record was mediocre. He was accepted to several law schools, but struggled academically once enrolled. At the University of Utah College of Law, he was failing most of his classes. His performance at trial, while confident, was legally incompetent by professional standards. He made basic procedural errors. He alienated the jury with his arrogance. Any competent defense attorney could have done better. His escapes from custody, while audacious, succeeded primarily because of institutional failures rather than brilliant planning. The first escape worked because he was left alone in an unlocked room with an open window. The second succeeded because he was housed in a small-town jail with minimal security during a holiday period when staff was reduced. The genius narrative serves a purpose. It makes Bundy seem like a unique threat, an exceptional criminal mind that required extraordinary effort to stop. But the truth is more mundane and more disturbing. He was a man of average to above-average intelligence who succeeded not because he was brilliant, but because the systems designed to protect potential victims were fragmented, under-resourced, and operating on assumptions about what a serial killer should look like. He succeeded because multiple people reported him to police, and those reports were ignored or deprioritized. He succeeded because there was no national database connecting crimes across state lines, no DNA testing, no centralized system for tracking patterns in unsolved murders. He succeeded because he looked normal, and in 1974, normal-looking men weren't considered capable of serial sexual murder. Consider the timeline again. Elizabeth Klopfer reported him to King County Police after the Lake Sammamish abductions. Anne Rule, his co-worker at the crisis hotline, also reported him. A psychology professor who'd supervised his work reported him. A woman from the Republican Party office reported him. 4 people who knew him personally looked at the composite sketch and recognized him immediately. And nothing happened. Why? Not because Bundy was such a masterful manipulator that he deceived trained investigators, but because those investigators saw an educated white man with no adult criminal record and political connections and dismissed the possibility that he could be dangerous. The failure wasn't Bundy's brilliance. It was systemic incompetence and unconscious bias about who commits violent crimes. Think about what this means. The most famous serial killer in American history, the case that's been studied more than any other, the man who's been described in countless books and documentaries as a criminal mastermind. succeeded primarily because police ignored multiple credible tips from people who knew him. That's not genius, that's luck, combined with institutional failure. And recognizing this matters because the genius narrative prevents us from seeing the actual patterns, the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed Bundy to operate, the ways that privilege and presentation create camouflage for predators who know how to exploit assumptions about respectability. There's another element of the Bundy mythology that deserves scrutiny, the idea that he fooled everyone, that no one suspected what he was capable of until after his arrest. This is demonstrably false. We know that Elizabeth Klopfer suspected him strongly enough to report him to police twice. We know that Anne Rule included him on her list of possible suspects, though she later said she tried to dismiss the idea because she couldn't reconcile the man she worked with at the crisis hotline with the monster described in police reports. We know that people who knew Bundy during his active killing years noticed behavioral changes, unexplained absences, strange items in his apartment. Some noticed and said nothing, perhaps because they couldn't believe their suspicions were valid. Others noticed and reported, only to be ignored by authorities. The narrative that everyone was completely fooled serves to absolve the systems that failed to act on available information. What actually happened was more complex and more damning. People noticed, people suspected, people reported. And the response from law enforcement was inadequate until Carol DeRonch escaped and could provide direct testimony, until physical evidence was collected from Bundy's car, until a routine traffic stop in Utah finally connected him to a crime. The investigation that followed wasn't a triumph of criminal profiling or brilliant detective work. It was a slow, painstaking process of connecting cases across state lines after Bundy had already been in custody, after he'd already been identified through luck and the bravery of a woman who fought back. Now consider the other mythology, that Bundy's crimes were the result of pornography addiction, or his illegitimate birth, or the rejection by Stephanie Brooks, or his grandfather's violence. These explanations all emerged from Bundy himself during various interviews over the years, and they've been repeated so many times that they've become part of the standard narrative. But here's what we know about Bundy. He was a compulsive liar who consistently deflected responsibility for his actions, who created different narratives for different audiences depending on what would serve his interests in that moment. To religious broadcaster James Dobson, he blamed pornography because that's what Dobson wanted to hear, and what might generate sympathy from conservative viewers. To FBI profilers, he discussed his childhood and the trauma of discovering his illegitimate birth, because that fit psychological frameworks they were interested in exploring. To journalists, he presented himself as a case study in the banality of evil, an ordinary man who'd been corrupted by societal forces beyond his control. But notice what's consistent across all these narratives. Bundy is never fully responsible. There's always an external factor, a corrupting influence, a mitigating circumstance that explains why he did what he did. Psychologists who evaluated Bundy diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and narcissism. People with this disorder often construct elaborate explanations for their behavior that position them as victims or as people responding to forces beyond their control. They are skilled at identifying what different audiences want to hear and providing narratives that satisfy those expectations while avoiding genuine accountability. This is what Bundy did throughout his life, and especially during the years between his conviction and execution, when he was being interviewed by everyone from FBI profilers to true crime authors to Christian broadcasters. The question we should be asking is not what made Ted Bundy kill, as though there's a simple causal chain we can trace from childhood trauma to serial murder. The question is, why do we keep accepting his explanations? Why do we privilege the narratives constructed by the killer himself over the evidence available from other sources? And what does it say about our collective psychology that we're more comfortable with a story about a brilliant, troubled man corrupted by external forces than with the simpler and more accurate story about a narcissistic predator who enjoyed hurting women and was enabled by systemic failures to continue doing so for years? There's a detail from the Chi Omega crime scene that rarely gets mentioned in popular retellings, but that reveals something essential about who Ted Bundy actually was. After beating Margaret Bowman to death and sexually assaulting Lisa Levy, after leaving bite marks on her body that would eventually help convict him, Bundy paused long enough to place a nylon stocking around Lisa Levy's neck and position her body in a specific way before leaving the room. This wasn't a frenzied attack, this was methodical. He was arranging the crime scene, creating a tableau demonstrating control, even in the midst of violence. And then he moved to the next room and attacked Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, beating them with the wooden club until their jaws were broken and their skulls fractured. They survived only because he was interrupted and fled the building. Think about what that scene represents. This wasn't a man driven by uncontrollable impulses or warped by pornography or acting out childhood trauma. This was someone who derived satisfaction from domination, who planned his attacks, who maintained enough self-control to arrange victims' bodies and move systematically from room to room, and who stopped only when external circumstances forced him to flee. The violence was purposeful, organized, and controlled. It was about power. The victims all resembled each other, and many resembled Stephanie Brooks, the girlfriend who'd rejected him. This pattern has been cited as evidence that Bundy was driven by revenge, that he was symbolically killing Stephanie over and over. But this explanation, while psychologically neat, may still be giving him too much credit. It assumes that his violence was about specific individuals, about a wound he was trying to heal or a loss he was trying to avenge. But serial sexual murderers aren't typically motivated by specific grievances against specific people. They're motivated by the pleasure they derive from domination and violence. The victims' resemblance to each other suggests not symbolic revenge, but a consistent sexual preference, a type he found attractive and therefore targeted. The fact that this type resembled Stephanie Brooks may be coincidental, or it may simply indicate that Stephanie represented an ideal he'd internalized based on his own attractions. What's most revealing about the Stephanie Brooks narrative is not that he killed women who resembled her, but that years after their breakup, he invested enormous effort into reconnecting with her, convincing her to consider marriage, and then coldly ending the relationship just to hurt her. This demonstrates something crucial about Bundy's psychology. He was capable of delaying gratification, of executing complex long-term plans purely for the satisfaction of dominating someone who'd once rejected him. That capacity for planning, for playing out scenarios over years just to experience the moment of control, is the same capacity that enabled his murders. The issue wasn't that he couldn't control himself, it's that he chose not to, because the gratification he received from violence and domination outweighed any moral restraint. Let's return to the question of how many people he actually killed, because this is where the gap between mythology and reality becomes most stark. Bundy confessed to 30 murders before his execution. This number has been widely reported and is treated as definitive in most accounts, but investigators who work the cases believe the actual number is significantly higher, potentially over 100. Why the discrepancy? Because even in his final confessions, Bundy was strategic about what he revealed. He provided information about cases where bodies had already been found, where he could be definitively linked through evidence. He was vague about cases where bodies had never been recovered, where he could confess without providing details that would allow verification. and he never confessed to crimes that might implicate anyone else or reveal aspects of his methodology he wanted to keep private. There are dozens of unsolved disappearances from the 1970s that fit Bundy's pattern: college-age women with long dark hair who vanished from areas where Bundy is known to have been. Some of these cases have been tentatively attributed to him based on circumstantial evidence. Others remain mysteries. The Anne-Marie Burr case, the 8-year-old girl who vanished from Tacoma in 1961 when Bundy was 14 and living in the same neighborhood, has never been solved. When asked about it directly, Bundy gave evasive answers that neither confirmed nor denied involvement. He seemed to enjoy the ambiguity, the power of keeping investigators uncertain about the full scope of his crimes. This brings us to another uncomfortable question: when did the killing actually begin? The official timeline starts in 1974 when Bundy was 27 years old, but there's evidence suggesting he may have started much earlier. Multiple witnesses from his college years in the late 1960s reported unsettling behavior. He would follow women at night, peek into windows, steal underwear from clotheslines. These are classic precursor behaviors for sexual predators. Voyeurism and burglary often precede more serious violence. If Bundy was engaging in these behaviors in his late teens and early 20s, it's plausible that he progressed to more serious crimes earlier than the confirmed timeline indicates. There's also the question of the years between his breakup with Stephanie Brooks in 1968 and the beginning of the confirmed killing spree in 1974. These 6 years are poorly documented. We know he worked various jobs, volunteered at the crisis hotline, got involved in politics, and returned to school. But there are gaps, periods where his whereabouts and activities are unclear. Did he kill during these years? Were there victims who were never connected to him because he was more careful, because the crimes occurred before investigators began looking for patterns? We'll never know definitively because Bundy took those secrets to his grave. What we can say is that serial killers don't typically begin their criminal careers in their late 20s with fully developed, sophisticated patterns of victim selection and crime scene management. They typically start earlier with less serious offenses that escalate over time. The crimes Bundy committed in 1974 demonstrated planning, preparation, and refined techniques. He knew how to approach victims in ways that minimized risk. He knew how to transport bodies without being observed. He knew how to select dump sites that delayed discovery. These aren't skills someone develops overnight. They suggest prior experience, prior crimes that may never be solved or connected to him. Consider also the geographical range of his confirmed crimes. He killed in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. Investigators suspect he also committed crimes in California and Wyoming based on travel records and unsolved cases, though these were never confirmed. This means he was operating across the entire western United States and parts of the South, moving between jurisdictions to avoid detection, selecting victims in places where he had no prior connection that might lead investigators to him. This level of mobility and strategic thinking suggests someone who'd refined his approach over time, who'd learned from experience how to minimize risk and evade capture. The forensic evidence from the cases where bodies were recovered reveals another disturbing pattern. Bundy kept victims alive for extended periods before killing them. In several cases, women who'd been reported missing were later determined to have been alive for days or even weeks after their abductions, based on evidence found at crime scenes or information Bundy provided in confessions. He would hold them captive, assault them repeatedly, and eventually murder them when he was finished. In some cases, he returned to dump sites after bodies had decomposed to engage in necrophilic acts, which he confessed to detectives during death row interviews. He also admitted to severing heads from some victims and keeping them as trophies, though he never specified which victims or where those remains might be located. These details are difficult to confront and they're often minimized or omitted in popular accounts because they're too disturbing, too graphic, too incompatible with the narrative of the charming law student who went wrong. But they're essential to understanding who Ted Bundy actually was. This wasn't someone who killed in moments of rage or loss of control. This was someone who planned abductions, prepared locations where he could keep victims hidden, and engaged in prolonged torture and sexual violence for his own gratification. The crimes were organized, purposeful, and sadistic in ways that can't be explained by pornography addiction or childhood trauma or romantic rejection. When you strip away the mythology and look at the actual evidence, what emerges is a portrait not of a tragic figure or a brilliant anti-hero, but of a predator who understood how to exploit systems, social expectations. He knew that educated white men with political connections weren't suspected of sexual violence. He knew that police departments in different states didn't communicate effectively with each other. He knew that women were socialized to be polite and helpful, and he exploited that socialization by feigning injury and asking for assistance. He knew that his conventional appearance and articulate manner would create cognitive dissonance for anyone who suspected him, because people didn't want to believe that someone who seemed normal could be dangerous. This is the real lesson of the Ted Bundy case, and it's the lesson we keep failing to learn because we're distracted by the mythology. The danger isn't extraordinary, it's ordinary. It's the person who seems trustworthy, who has social capital, who knows how to perform normalcy convincingly. The systems designed to protect people from violence are vulnerable not to criminal masterminds, but to predators who understand how those systems work and how to move through their gaps and blind spots. Consider what happened after Carol Durant escaped. She gave police a detailed description of her attacker and his car. She described the unusual handcuffs he'd used. She worked with a sketch artist, and when Ted Bundy was eventually arrested months later for the unrelated traffic stop, it still took investigators time to connect him to the Durant case because he didn't fit their preconceptions about what a serial kidnapper and murderer should look like. He was enrolled in law school. He had no violent criminal history on record as an adult. He was articulate and cooperative during initial questioning. It wasn't until they showed Carol Durant a photo lineup and she identified him immediately that the connection became undeniable. And even then, even after he was convicted of kidnapping Carol Durant and sentenced to prison, even after he was charged with murder in Colorado and the evidence began accumulating, there were people who couldn't believe it. People who knew him, who'd worked alongside him, who'd seen him as charming and helpful and normal. Anne Rule, the true crime writer who'd shared shifts with him at the crisis hotline, wrestled for years with the cognitive dissonance of having known him as a friend while he was simultaneously hunting women. She wrote about the experience in The Stranger Beside Me, describing how she'd tried to reconcile the person she knew with the person described in police reports and court testimony. She ultimately concluded that there were two Ted Bundys, the public persona and the hidden predator, and that even people who knew him well had only ever seen the performance. But maybe that framing is too generous. Maybe there weren't two Ted Bundys. Maybe there was only ever one, and the charming, helpful, empathetic crisis hotline volunteer was simply another victim he was manipulating, another person he was using to construct an alibi of normalcy. Anne Rule, by her own account, liked him, trusted him, thought of him as a friend. And he used that relationship as cover, knowing that if his name ever came up in connection with the disappearances, she would vouch for him, would tell investigators that he was kind and compassionate and incapable of violence. She did exactly that. When she first saw the Lake Sammamish composite sketch, she thought it resembled Ted But she dismissed the idea because she couldn't imagine him hurting anyone. When she heard his name mentioned in connection with the investigation, she told herself it was impossible, that the police must be looking at the wrong person. It wasn't until after his conviction, after the evidence had become overwhelming, that she allowed herself to accept the reality of what he'd done. And even then, she struggled with guilt, wondering if there were signs she should have noticed, if her friendship had been part of what allowed him to continue killing. This is what predators like Bundy count on. The reluctance of people who know them to believe they're capable of violence, the instinct to defend them against accusations that seem incompatible with their public behavior. And this is why the mythology around Bundy is so dangerous. When we describe him as extraordinarily charming, as a brilliant manipulator who fooled everyone, we create the impression that only someone with exceptional skills could have done what he did. We make it seem like an aberration, a unique case that required unique abilities. But the truth is that predators who exploit trust and respectability are not rare. They're not geniuses. They're simply people who understand social dynamics well enough to use them, and who lack the moral constraints that prevent most people from harming others. The trials themselves became spectacles, media events that transformed Bundy into a celebrity. Court TV didn't exist yet, but the trials were televised locally and footage was distributed nationally. Cameras captured Bundy questioning witnesses, making arguments, presenting himself as his own defense attorney. For a narcissist who craved attention and validation, this was ideal. He was the center of a national conversation. People debated his guilt or innocence. Women sent him love letters. He received marriage proposals. Carol Ann Boone, who'd known him in Washington and had moved to Florida to be near him, married him during the penalty phase of his trial, using an obscure Florida law that allowed declarations of marriage in open court to be legally binding. She later became pregnant during a prison visit, though how this occurred given security protocols has never been fully explained. She gave birth to a daughter in 1982 and maintained Bundy's innocence until eventually divorcing him and disappearing from public view years before his execution. The fact that Bundy received love letters and marriage proposals while on trial for murdering women reveals something unsettling about how certain kinds of violent men are romanticized, particularly when they're conventionally attractive and articulate. There's a phenomenon sometimes called hybristophilia, attraction to people who've committed crimes, and Bundy became perhaps the most famous example. Women who'd never met him wrote to express their belief in his innocence, their conviction that he was being persecuted, their desire to support him. Some of these letters were overtly sexual. Others were romantic, imagining futures where he would be exonerated and they could be together. The psychology behind this phenomenon is complex, involving elements of narcissism, the desire to be special to someone notorious, the fantasy of being the one person who truly understands the misunderstood figure. But it's worth noting that this attention was specific to Bundy's presentation. He was educated, white, conventionally attractive by the standards of the era, and articulate. He presented as middle class, as someone who could have been a lawyer or politician, as someone who existed in the same social sphere as the people watching his trial on television. Violent criminals who don't fit this profile, who are poor or uneducated or from marginalized communities, don't receive love letters. They don't get marriage proposals. The romanticization is tied to privilege and presentation, to the cognitive dissonance created when someone who looks like he should be successful is revealed to be violent. And Bundy exploited this reaction, playing to the cameras, performing the role of the wrongfully accused man, maintaining his innocence long past the point when the evidence had become overwhelming. He didn't confess to any murders until January 1989, just days before his scheduled execution, when he finally admitted to killing women in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. Even then, his confessions were strategic, controlled, designed to extract maximum value from the information he was providing. He would tell investigators about a murder, provide just enough detail to confirm he was the killer, then stop and wait to see if they would delay his execution in exchange for more information. He was trading lives for time, offering closure to families in exchange for days or hours of continued existence. And even in those final confessions, he was evasive about total numbers, vague about certain details, protective of information that might implicate him in crimes he hadn't been charged with, or that might reveal aspects of his methodology he wanted to keep private. Robert Keppel, the detective who interviewed him during this period, later described Bundy as someone who couldn't stop performing even facing death, who needed to maintain control of the narrative, who derived satisfaction from keeping investigators uncertain and dependent on his willingness to cooperate. Keppel asked him directly how many women he'd killed. Bundy's response was evasive, something along the lines of add one digit to what you currently think and you'll be close. If investigators believed he'd killed 30 women, was he suggesting 40? 130, he wouldn't clarify. He seemed to enjoy the ambiguity, the power of being the only person who knew the full scope of his crimes. In the final days before his execution, Bundy's attorneys filed multiple appeals seeking stays, arguing everything from procedural errors in the trial to questions about his mental competency to be executed. All were denied. The execution was scheduled for 7:00 a.m. on January 24, 1989. Outside Florida State Prison, crowds began gathering the night before, holding signs, setting up grills for what they described as Bundy's last cookout, celebrating his impending death with a festive atmosphere that felt both understandable, given the magnitude of his crimes, and troubling in its suggestion that execution could be entertainment. At the scheduled time, Bundy was escorted to the death chamber and strapped into the electric chair. His head and right leg were shaved to ensure proper contact with the electrodes. A leather hood was placed over his face. According to witnesses, his last words were a request that his love be given to his family and friends. Then the executioner activated the chair, and 2 Ulm volts surged through his body for 1 minute. He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. Outside, the crowd cheered. News cameras captured the celebration, the fireworks, the sense of closure that his death seemed to provide to people who'd followed the case for years. But what kind of closure was it really? Ted Bundy was dead, yes, but dozens of families still didn't know what had happened to their daughters, their sisters, their friends. Bodies remained undiscovered, cases remained unsolved, and the systems that had enabled his crimes, the fragmentation of law enforcement across jurisdictions, the assumptions about what violent criminals look like, the tendency to dismiss or deprioritize reports from women who suspected they knew the killer, all of those systems remained in place, unchanged by Bundy's execution. The FBI had begun developing the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, a database designed to help investigators identify patterns across jurisdictions and connect cases that might be related. The program was partly a response to the Bundy case, an acknowledgement that serial killers could operate across state lines, and that without centralized information sharing, individual police departments would continue to investigate cases in isolation, missing patterns that might be obvious if all the data were compiled in one place. VICAP became operational in 1985, while Bundy was still on death row. It represented a systemic response to the failures his case had revealed, but even VICAP couldn't solve the deeper problem, which was cultural and psychological rather than merely logistical. The Bundy case revealed how much protective camouflage conventional appearance and respectability provides, how reluctant people are to believe that someone who seems normal could be dangerous, how easy it is for predators to exploit the gap between their public presentation and their private behavior. And in the decades since Bundy's execution, we've seen this pattern repeat. Larry Nassar, the USA gymnastics doctor who sexually abused hundreds of young athletes, was reported by multiple victims and their families over years, but his professional credentials and respectable position made it difficult for people to believe the accusations. Jerry Sandusky, the Penn State assistant football coach convicted of sexually abusing boys, was protected by institutional loyalty and the assumption that someone in his position couldn't be a predator. Harvey Weinstein operated openly as a sexual predator in Hollywood for decades, protected by power, money, and people's willingness to look away. The lesson of Ted Bundy isn't that he was uniquely dangerous or brilliant. It's that our systems are vulnerable to anyone who understands how to exploit respectability, who knows that certain kinds of privilege create immunity from suspicion, who recognizes that even when people report their concerns, those reports can be dismissed if they conflict with prevailing assumptions about who commits violence. Elizabeth Klopfer reported him twice, and nothing happened. Anne Rule included him on her list of possible suspects, and nothing happened. Multiple witnesses at Lake Sammamish described a man named Ted with a Volkswagen Beetle, and the investigation proceeded slowly because there were too many tips and not enough resources to follow up on all of them. Carol DeRonch escaped and identified him, but it still took months to connect him to the broader pattern of murders. Every step of the way there were opportunities to stop him earlier, and every step of the way those opportunities were missed because Ted Bundy looked like someone who shouldn't be capable of violence. And this is where the mythology becomes most dangerous, because when we tell the story of Ted Bundy as a brilliant, charming monster who fooled everyone, we're implying that the failure to catch him earlier was inevitable, that no one could have seen through his disguise, that the systems worked as well as they could have given his exceptional skills. But that's not true. The systems failed. Repeatedly. Obviously. And they failed not because Bundy was a genius, but because they were designed with assumptions about what criminals look like that privileged people like him could easily exploit. Think about the moment when Officer Bob Hayward pulled over the tan Volkswagen Beetle in suburban Salt Lake City. It was a routine traffic stop, the kind of interaction that happens thousands of times every day. Hayward had noticed the car driving slowly with its lights off in a residential neighborhood. When he activated his patrol lights, the car fled, running a stop sign before eventually pulling over. The driver was polite, apologetic, claimed he'd been lost after attending a drive-in movie. But Hayward's instincts told him something was wrong, so he asked to search the car. He found handcuffs, rope, a crowbar, an ice pick, a ski mask. The driver consented to the search, probably assuming the items could be explained away as tools or camping equipment, but Hayward arrested him anyway for evading police and possessing burglary tools. That traffic stop was the beginning of the end for Ted Bundy, though it would take years for the full scope of his crimes to be revealed. It was a moment of pure chance, an alert police officer noticing a car that seemed out of place, trusting his instincts enough to investigate despite the driver's conventional appearance and cooperative demeanor. And it demonstrates something crucial. Bundy was caught not through brilliant detective work or sophisticated profiling, but through routine police work, a traffic stop, a consenting search, physical evidence that linked him to crimes. After his arrest, detectives began connecting cases. They found gas receipts that placed him in Colorado on dates when women had disappeared. They found hair fibers in his car. They showed his photo to Carol DeRonch, who identified him immediately. Slowly, the pattern became visible. But it required investigators to look past his conventional appearance, his educational background, his lack of a serious criminal record. It required them to believe that someone who seemed normal could have committed dozens of murders. Some investigators found this easier than others. Jerry Thompson, the detective in Utah who first connected Bundy to multiple cases, later said that he'd had a visceral negative reaction to Bundy during their initial interview, that something about his manner had seemed performative and false, even when he was being cooperative. Robert Keppel, who'd investigated the Lake Sammamish disappearances and interviewed Bundy years later on death row, described him as someone who was always performing, always calculating, even when he seemed to be having a normal conversation. These detectives saw through the presentation because they were looking for it, because their professional experience had taught them that predators often seem charming and normal, but other people couldn't see it or didn't want to. Carol Ann Boone, who married him during his trial and had a child with him, maintained his innocence for years. People who'd worked with him at the crisis hotline struggled to reconcile the helpful volunteer they'd known with the killer described in court testimony. His attorneys, initially assigned to assist him when he insisted on representing himself, later said they'd found him frustrating and manipulative, but also oddly likable in person, that it was difficult to hold in mind simultaneously the charming client and the brutal crimes he'd committed. This cognitive dissonance is central to understanding why the Bundy mythology persists. We want to believe that monsters are obviously monstrous, that evil is recognizable, that we would be able to identify a serial killer if we encountered one. When someone like Bundy demonstrates that predators can seem completely normal, can be people we work with or date or consider friends, it's deeply unsettling. It's easier to reframe him as exceptional, as a uniquely skilled manipulator, than to accept that the danger is ordinary and that our ability to recognize it is limited. But accepting that reality is essential if we want to prevent similar cases in the future. We need to design systems that don't rely on assumptions about what criminals look like. We need to take reports seriously, even when they implicate people who seem respectable or successful. We need to connect information across jurisdictions and recognize patterns that individual departments might miss. And we need to be honest about the fact that privilege provides camouflage for predators, that being educated or articulate or conventionally attractive creates a halo effect that makes it harder for people to believe accusations of violence. The Bundy case prompted changes in how law enforcement approaches serial crime. VICAP was created to connect cases across jurisdictions. The FBI developed more sophisticated profiling techniques. Police departments began training officers to recognize patterns in missing persons cases and to look past superficial characteristics when evaluating suspects. These changes have likely prevented some crimes and helped solve others. But they haven't eliminated the underlying problem, because the underlying problem is cultural and psychological, not merely procedural. We still live in a society where certain kinds of people are assumed to be dangerous and others are assumed to be safe, where reports from women are often dismissed or minimized, where victims are asked what they did to invite violence rather than why perpetrators chose to commit it. These biases create vulnerabilities that predators exploit, and until we address them directly, until we acknowledge that danger often looks normal and that our instincts about who to trust are shaped by prejudices rather than evidence, we'll continue to see cases where perpetrators operate in plain sight, where people report concerns that are ignored, where victims are blamed for failing to recognize threats that they were socialized to trust. Ted Bundy died over 35 years ago, but the conversation about him continues, renewed periodically by documentaries, movies, podcasts, books. Each new retelling claims to reveal the real story, to provide insights that previous accounts missed, to explain finally what made him kill. But most of these retellings simply recycle the same mythology. He was handsome, he was charming, he was brilliant, he fooled everyone. And each retelling that repeats these myths obscures the actual lessons of the case, the systemic failures and cultural biases that enabled his crimes. The 2019 Netflix documentary, Conversations with a Killer. The Ted Bundy tapes presented audio from Bundy's death row interviews alongside archival footage and contemporary analysis. It was compelling television, and it reached a large audience, many of whom were encountering the case in detail for the first time. But it also contributed to the mythology by framing Bundy as a uniquely fascinating figure, by centering his voice and his explanations rather than the experiences of victims and survivors, by presenting his self-narratives as insight rather than manipulation. The same year, the film Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile starred Zac Efron as Bundy and told the story primarily from the perspective of Elizabeth Klopfer, his longtime girlfriend. The film was controversial because Efron's casting reinforced the idea that Bundy was extraordinarily handsome, because the perspective angle made it possible to watch the film and forget for long stretches that the protagonist was a serial killer, because it risked romanticizing someone who should never be romanticized. Critics pointed out that the film's focus on Bundy's charm and Elizabeth's conflicted feelings created sympathy for him in ways that were inappropriate given his crimes. Defenders argued that the film was specifically about how predators use charm to manipulate people who care about them, and that showing that process required making Bundy seem sympathetic at times. Both positions have merit, but they circle around the deeper problem. We keep telling Ted Bundy's story as though it's about him, as though understanding his psychology or his childhood or his motivations is the key insight. But the story isn't about him. It's about the systems that failed to protect his victims, about the biases that made it difficult for people to believe he was dangerous, about the women who tried to warn authorities and were ignored, about the survivors who lived with trauma because someone decided their reports weren't credible enough to investigate seriously. The 2020 documentary Falling for a Killer took a different approach, deliberately centering the experiences of women who survived Bundy's attacks or who lost loved ones to him. It featured Elizabeth Kendall, who'd mostly avoided public attention in the decades since Bundy's execution, speaking on camera about her relationship with him and her struggles to reconcile who she thought he was with what he'd actually done. It included testimony from survivors and from family members of victims, people whose stories are often marginalized in favor of focusing on the killer. This shift in perspective is important because it redirects attention to where it belongs, not on the fascinating psychology of the perpetrator, but on the experiences of the people he harmed and the systems that failed them. When we center perpetrators in these stories, we implicitly validate their narcissism, their need for attention, their belief that they're exceptional and worthy of study. When we center victims and survivors, we acknowledge that the real story is about harm, not about the person who caused it. But even shifting perspective isn't enough if we're not willing to confront the uncomfortable truths the case reveals. Ted Bundy succeeded because he looked like someone who shouldn't be dangerous. He succeeded because systems designed to protect people from violence were fragmented and under-resourced. He succeeded because multiple people reported him, and those reports were ignored. He succeeded because he understood that certain kinds of privilege create immunity from suspicion. And he succeeded because we, collectively, are more comfortable believing that monsters are obviously monstrous than accepting that danger can look completely normal. Every time we tell the story of Ted Bundy as a brilliant, charming monster who fooled everyone, we reinforce the idea that his crimes were somehow exceptional. that it took unique circumstances and unique abilities for him to do what he did. And every time we reinforce that idea, we make it harder to recognize the next predator who exploits respectability and privilege to harm people, because we're looking for the exceptional rather than seeing the ordinary danger that hides in plain sight. The truth is that Ted Bundy wasn't that smart, wasn't that charming, and didn't fool everyone. He was a predator with average intelligence who exploited systemic vulnerabilities. People suspected him and reported him, and their reports were ignored or deprioritized because he didn't fit the profile of what investigators thought a serial killer should look like. He was caught because of routine police work and physical evidence, not because of brilliant investigation, and he continued killing for as long as he did because we live in a society that grants credibility and the benefit of doubt to certain kinds of people while dismissing or minimizing reports from others, particularly women. These are the real lessons of the Ted Bundy case. Not that he was extraordinary, but that our systems are vulnerable. Not that he was brilliant, but that we're biased. Not that he fooled everyone, but that we chose not to listen when people tried to warn us. And until we're willing to confront these lessons directly, till we redesign our systems and challenge our biases and take seriously the reports of people who suspect someone they know might be dangerous, we'll continue to see cases where predators operate in plain sight while everyone around them struggles to believe what they're seeing. Think about Elizabeth Klopfer one more time, calling the police to report the man she'd been dating for years, the man she'd built a life with, because she looked at a composite sketch and recognized him immediately. Think about the courage that required to betray someone you love because you suspect he might be capable of terrible things. Think about the vulnerability of making that call, knowing you might be wrong, knowing it might end your relationship, knowing that if you're right, it means the person you trusted was a monster. And then think about the police thanking her for the information and doing nothing, effectively telling her that her suspicions weren't credible, that they knew better than she did about who could be dangerous. She called twice. Anne Rule reported him. A psychology professor reported him. A political colleague reported him. 4 people who knew him personally looked at the evidence and said, "I think this might be Ted Bundy." And the response was inadequate until he was caught through pure chance during a traffic stop. What does that tell us about whose voices we trust? What does it tell us about whose suspicions we take seriously? What does it tell us about the value we place on women's safety and women's intuition about danger? These are questions we still haven't adequately answered, and they're the questions that matter most, not what made Ted Bundy kill, not what childhood trauma or romantic rejection or pornography consumption shaped him, but why we didn't listen when people tried to warn us, why we privilege respectability over evidence, why we're more comfortable with the myth of the exceptional monster than with the reality of ordinary danger hiding behind conventional presentation. Ted Bundy killed at least 30 women, probably many more. He destroyed families, traumatized survivors, and left gaps in communities that have never been filled. And he was able to do all of that not because he was brilliant or because he had some unique capacity for deception, but because we made it easy for him, because our systems were designed with assumptions that privileged people like him could exploit, because we didn't listen when people who knew him tried to warn us, because we wanted to believe that someone who looked normal, who sounded educated, who seemed charming, couldn't possibly be capable of the violence he was committing in the darkness between his performances of normalcy. That's the real horror of the Ted Bundy case. Not that monsters exist, but that we're complicit in enabling them when they know how to look like us.